In the year 303 AD, in a public square somewhere in the Roman Empire, a crowd gathered to witness something so horrific that even battle-hardened soldiers would turn away in disgust. A Christian bishop named Erasmus was about to endure one of the most brutal executions in recorded history. His intestines slowly wound out of his living body on a windlass, like thread from a spool. This is the story of Saint Erasmus, a man whose faith was tested by the most savage tortures the Roman Empire could devise, yet who never wavered in his beliefs. The early 4th century marked one of the darkest periods for Christians in the Roman Empire. Under the joint rule of Emperors Diocletian and Maximian, what historians call the Great Persecution unleashed a systematic campaign of terror against followers of Christ. Churches were destroyed, sacred texts burned, and Christians faced a choice that would define their eternal fate: renounce their faith and live, or maintain their beliefs and face unimaginable suffering. Among those who chose suffering over surrender was Erasmus, Bishop of Formiae, a coastal city in central Italy. His name would become synonymous with unwavering faith in the face of absolute brutality. But before we witness his final moments, we must understand the man, the times, and the empire that created one of history's most enduring tales of martyrdom. The Roman Empire of 303 AD was a civilization built on power, conquest, and the absolute authority of its emperors. For nearly 3 centuries, Christianity had grown from a small Jewish sect to a movement that threatened the very foundations of Roman religious tradition. The old gods, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, were being abandoned in favor of a carpenter from Nazareth who preached love, forgiveness, and eternal life. This wasn't merely a religious conflict, it was a battle for the soul of an empire. Roman identity was inextricably linked to its pantheon of deities and the divine status of its emperors. Christians refused to participate in emperor worship, refused to honor the traditional gods, and spoke of a kingdom not of this world. To Roman authorities, this wasn't just heresy, it was treason. Diocletian, despite his earlier tolerance of Christians, eventually succumbed to pressure from his subordinates and advisors who saw Christianity as a destabilizing force. His co-emperor Maximian, ruling the western portion of the empire, was known for his particular cruelty and had no qualms about implementing the harshest measures against the Christian population. The persecution that began in 303 AD was methodical and comprehensive. The first edict ordered the destruction of Christian churches and scriptures. The second commanded the arrest of Christian clergy. The third offered freedom to those who would sacrifice to the Roman gods. The fourth and final edict extended the demand for sacrifice to all Christians throughout the empire. Those who refused faced imprisonment, torture, and death. It was into this world of systematic oppression that Bishop Erasmus found himself thrust. As a leader of the Christian community in Formiae, he was a prime target for Roman authorities. His very position made him a symbol of Christian resistance, and his capture would send a powerful message to other believers about the futility of opposing imperial will. Erasmus was born into a world where Christianity was still finding its place within the vast Roman Empire. Little is recorded about his early life, but historical accounts suggest he was born into a Christian family sometime in the mid-3rd century, possibly around 250 AD. This timing would place his childhood during the reign of Emperor Decius, who conducted the first empire-wide persecution of Christians in 250–251 AD. Growing up during this period of sporadic persecution would have shaped young Erasmus's understanding of what it meant to follow Christ. He would have witnessed the courage of martyrs, seen families torn apart by religious conviction, and learned that faith often came at the ultimate price. These early experiences likely forged the iron determination that would characterize his later ministry. As he matured, Erasmus demonstrated exceptional qualities that marked him for religious leadership. Ancient sources describe him as eloquent, learned in scripture, and possessed of a deep compassion for his fellow Christians. His theological training would have included study of the Hebrew Scriptures, the growing collection of Christian writings that would eventually form the New Testament, and the teachings of earlier church fathers. The city of Formiae, where Erasmus eventually became bishop, was strategically located along the Appian Way, the famous Roman road that connected Rome to the southern regions of Italy. This positioning made Formiae an important commercial center and a crossroads where people, goods, and ideas flowed freely. For a Christian leader, it represented both opportunity and danger. Opportunity to spread the gospel to travelers and merchants from across the empire, but danger from the constant presence of Roman officials and military personnel. Erasmus's elevation to the bishopric of Formiae likely occurred in the 280s or early 290s, during a period of relative peace for Christians under Emperor Diocletian's early rule. This period, sometimes called the Little Peace of the Church, allowed Christian communities to grow, build churches, and organize themselves more openly than they had been able to do in previous decades. As bishop, Erasmus would have been responsible for the spiritual welfare of all Christians in his diocese, which probably encompassed several towns and rural areas around Formiae. His duties included conducting worship services, ordaining priests and deacons, managing church property, providing for the poor and widows, and serving as the primary teacher and interpreter of Christian doctrine for his community. Historical accounts describe Erasmus as a gifted preacher whose sermons drew large crowds, including pagans curious about the Christian message. His ability to explain complex theological concepts in ways that common people could understand made him particularly effective at converting non-Christians. This success, while spiritually rewarding, also made him increasingly visible to Roman authorities who were beginning to view Christianity with growing suspicion. The growing Christian community under Erasmus's leadership didn't go unnoticed by local Roman officials. Reports suggest that by the early 300s, the church in Formiae had become one of the most prominent Christian communities in central Italy, with a sophisticated organizational structure, substantial property holdings, and influence that extended well beyond the city's boundaries. This prominence would soon make Erasmus and his followers prime targets in the coming persecution. The transformation of Diocletian from a tolerant ruler to the architect of the most systematic persecution of Christians in Roman history didn't happen overnight. When he became emperor in 284 AD, Diocletian inherited an empire in crisis. Economic inflation, military challenges on multiple frontiers, and political instability that had seen 50 emperors in the previous 50 years. His initial focus was on administrative and military reforms, not religious persecution. For the first 18 years of his reign, Christians enjoyed unprecedented freedom. Churches were built openly, Christian officials served in government positions, and the faith spread rapidly throughout all levels of Roman society. Some historians estimate that by 300 AD, Christians comprised perhaps 10 to 15% of the empire's population, a substantial minority that could no longer be ignored or easily suppressed. The shift toward persecution began around 299 AD, influenced by several factors that convinced Diocletian and his advisors that Christianity posed a genuine threat to imperial stability. Military commanders complained that Christian soldiers were refusing to participate in traditional religious ceremonies that were considered essential for military unit cohesion and divine protection in battle. Pagan priests warned that the gods were withdrawing their favor from Rome because of Christian atheism, the Christian refusal to acknowledge the traditional deities. Perhaps most significantly, Diocletian's co-emperor Galerius, who governed the eastern provinces, was virulently anti-Christian and constantly pressured Diocletian to take action against what he saw as a seditious movement. Galerius's mother was a devout pagan priestess who had instilled in her son a deep hatred for Christianity, viewing it as a foreign corruption of Roman values and traditions. The immediate trigger for persecution came from an incident during a sacrifice to the gods at the imperial court. When the pagan priests examined the sacrificial animal's entrails for divine omens, they claimed they could read no signs because Christians present at the ceremony had made the sign of the cross, thus interfering with the ritual. This relatively minor incident became the excuse Diocletian's advisors needed to argue for decisive action against Christianity. On February 23, 303 AD, the first edict of persecution was issued. It ordered the destruction of Christian churches and scriptures, the confiscation of church property, and the removal of Christians from government positions. Christians were also stripped of certain legal rights, making them vulnerable to arbitrary arrest and punishment. The edict was carefully crafted to avoid explicitly calling for bloodshed, perhaps reflecting Diocletian's own reluctance to resort to wholesale slaughter. However, the implementation of the edict quickly escalated beyond its original scope. Local governors, eager to demonstrate their loyalty to the emperor, often exceeded the edict's requirements. In many regions, Christian leaders were immediately arrested, and those who refused to hand over sacred texts, the so-called traditores, or those who hand over, faced torture and death. The situation deteriorated further when fires broke out at the imperial palace in Nicomedia, Diocletian's eastern capital, in the weeks following the first edict. Although the cause of the fires was never determined, Christians were blamed, and Diocletian became convinced that they were plotting against him. This paranoia led to increasingly harsh measures and the issuance of additional edicts that systematically stripped Christians of all legal protections. By late 303 AD, the persecution had reached Formiae, and Bishop Erasmus found himself facing an impossible choice. He could comply with imperial demands to surrender church property and scriptures, participate in pagan sacrifices, and effectively abandon his Christian identity, or he could resist and face the consequences that were becoming more severe and brutal with each passing month. For a man who had spent his adult life shepherding Christian souls and defending the faith, there was really no choice at all. When Roman soldiers arrived in Formiae with orders to arrest Bishop Erasmus and force him to surrender the church's sacred texts, they found an empty episcopal residence and a Christian community that claimed ignorance of their leader's whereabouts. Erasmus had received advance warning of the impending crackdown, whether from sympathizers within the Roman administration or from fellow Christians fleeing other persecuted communities, and had made the difficult decision to abandon his flock temporarily rather than risk capture. The decision to flee was not made lightly. For a bishop, abandoning one's diocese was considered a serious dereliction of duty, potentially compromising the spiritual welfare of hundreds or thousands of Christian souls. However, Erasmus and other church leaders recognized that their capture would effectively decapitate the Christian movement in their regions, leaving ordinary believers without guidance, sacraments, or organizational structure during the most dangerous period in the Church's history. Erasmus chose the rugged mountains of Lebanon as his refuge, a decision that reveals both practical wisdom and symbolic significance. The Lebanese mountains were remote, difficult for Roman forces to patrol effectively, and home to various hermits and ascetics who had withdrawn from the world for religious reasons. The terrain itself, with its caves, dense forests, and treacherous paths, provided natural protection for those who knew how to survive in the wilderness. The symbolic dimension of this choice would not have been lost on contemporary Christians. The mountains had biblical significance as places where God's people found refuge from persecution. Moses on Mount Sinai, Elijah on Mount Horeb, Jesus himself retreating to mountainous areas for prayer and solitude. By fleeing to the mountains, Erasmus was following a pattern established by the greatest figures of Jewish and Christian tradition. Life in exile was harsh beyond imagination. Erasmus, accustomed to the relative comfort of episcopal residence and the regular meals provided by his Christian community, now faced daily struggles for basic survival. He had to find or construct shelter, locate sources of fresh water, forage for edible plants, and somehow obtain adequate clothing for the harsh mountain winters. The psychological toll was perhaps even greater than the physical hardships. Ancient sources describe Erasmus spending his exile in prayer, meditation, and the composition of letters to other Christian leaders and communities. These letters, fragments of which survive in later church histories, reveal a man wrestling with doubt, guilt over abandoning his flock, and yet maintaining an unshakable faith in God's ultimate plan. He wrote of receiving visions and dreams that sustained him during the darkest moments of isolation and despair. The 7-year period of exile allowed Erasmus to develop a more profound understanding of Christian spirituality and theology. Away from the administrative demands of episcopal office, he was able to contemplate the deeper mysteries of faith, study scripture more intensively, and develop the theological insights that would make his later preaching even more powerful and effective. This period of enforced contemplation transformed him from an effective church administrator into a true mystic and spiritual master. During these years, Erasmus also maintained contact with the wider Christian community through a network of supporters who risked their lives to bring him news, supplies, and messages from other persecuted believers. These brave individuals, often ordinary Christians who refused to abandon their exiled bishop, created an underground communication system that kept Erasmus informed about developments in the persecution and allowed him to continue providing spiritual guidance to his scattered flock. The exile years also witnessed Erasmus developing a reputation for miraculous powers. Stories circulated among Christians about his ability to survive impossible hardships, his prophetic visions of future events, and even reports of supernatural provision of food and shelter. While these accounts must be evaluated critically, they reflect the deep respect and admiration that contemporary Christians felt for their exiled bishop's extraordinary courage and faith. In early 310 AD, after 7 grueling years in the Lebanese mountains, Bishop Erasmus experienced what he would later describe as the most significant supernatural encounter of his life. According to his own testimony and the accounts of contemporary Christian historians, an angel appeared to him in a vision so vivid and compelling that it transformed his understanding of his calling and mission as a Christian leader. The angel, described in accounts as radiating divine light and speaking with a voice like thunder, delivered a simple but terrifying command. Erasmus must leave his mountain refuge and return to his episcopal duties in Formiae. The angel's message emphasized that the time of hiding was over, that God required his servant to bear witness openly regardless of the consequences, and that his flock needed their shepherd during these dark times. This divine command presented Erasmus with an agonizing dilemma. 7 years of exile had given him intimate knowledge of the persecution's brutality and scope. He knew that returning to Formiae meant almost certain arrest, torture, and death. Reports from the outside world had brought news of countless martyrs, bishops, priests, and ordinary Christians who had suffered unimaginable torments rather than renounce their faith. To return was essentially to accept a death sentence. Yet the vision's authenticity was undeniable to Erasmus. The angel's presence had filled him with a supernatural peace and certainty that transcended rational calculation. More importantly, the command aligned with his deepest understanding of Christian duty and the example set by Christ himself, who had willingly accepted suffering and death rather than abandon his mission. The bishop recognized that his years of preparation in the wilderness had been leading to this moment of ultimate test. The journey from the Lebanese mountains back to Formiae took several weeks and required careful planning to avoid Roman patrols and checkpoints. Erasmus traveled mostly at night, following ancient trade routes and relying on the network of Christian supporters who had sustained him during his exile. These brave individuals provided food, shelter, and information about Roman troop movements, understanding that they were helping their bishop return to certain martyrdom. As word of Erasmus's return spread through the Christian community, it created a mixture of joy and terror among his followers. They were overjoyed to have their beloved bishop back among them, but they also understood that his presence would inevitably draw Roman attention and likely result in renewed persecution for the entire community. Some urged him to return to hiding. Others accepted his explanation that God had commanded his return and prepared themselves for whatever might follow. Erasmus's first actions upon returning to Formiae demonstrated his complete commitment to his divine mission. Rather than maintaining a low profile, he immediately began conducting Christian services, meeting with community leaders, and preaching to ever-growing crowds of believers and curious pagans. His sermons during this period, preserved in fragments by later historians, reveal a man transformed by his wilderness experience and utterly fearless in proclaiming Christian truth. The theological content of these sermons was particularly remarkable for its emphasis on martyrdom as the highest form of Christian witness. Erasmus spoke eloquently about the privilege of suffering for Christ, the temporary nature of physical pain compared to eternal spiritual reward, and the power of martyrdom to inspire and strengthen the broader Christian community. These messages were clearly preparing his flock for the trials that lay ahead. Within weeks of his return, Roman authorities in Formiae received reports of increased Christian activity and the presence of the long-sought Bishop Erasmus. Local officials, under pressure from their superiors to enforce the persecution edicts rigorously, began planning his arrest. They understood that capturing such a prominent Christian leader would send a powerful message throughout the region and might finally break the stubborn resistance of the local Christian community. The arrest of Bishop Erasmus occurred in dramatic fashion during a Christian worship service in late 310 AD. Roman soldiers, acting on detailed intelligence about the location and timing of Christian gatherings, surrounded the building where Erasmus was conducting what would prove to be his final free celebration of the Eucharist. The congregation, trapped between armed soldiers and their beloved bishop, watched in terror as their worst fears were realized. Erasmus made no attempt to flee or resist arrest. Contemporary accounts describe him calmly finishing the liturgy, blessing his congregation one final time, and then walking peacefully toward the Roman soldiers. His dignity and composure in this moment of crisis made a powerful impression on everyone present, Christians who saw their bishop's courage, and even some Roman soldiers who were struck by his apparent lack of fear in the face of certain torture and death. The journey to the provincial capital, where Erasmus would face Emperor Diocletian himself, took several days. During this time, the bishop was kept in chains, but continued to preach to anyone who would listen. Fellow prisoners, guards, and curious onlookers in the towns they passed through. His captors, initially amused by what they saw as futile defiance, gradually became uncomfortable with Erasmus's unwavering confidence and the effect his words were having on those around him. The first face-to-face encounter between Bishop Erasmus and Emperor Diocletian was a clash between two fundamentally different worldviews. Diocletian, the most powerful man in the Western world, represented the authority of Rome, the wisdom of traditional religion, and the practical necessity of political unity. Erasmus, a prisoner in chains, represented loyalty to a higher authority, faith in unseen realities, and willingness to die rather than compromise his convictions. Diocletian initially attempted to reason with Erasmus, pointing out the futility of resistance and offering him wealth, position, and safety if he would simply acknowledge the Roman gods and participate in a symbolic sacrifice. The emperor's approach was calculated. He understood that forcing a respected Christian leader to publicly renounce his faith would be far more damaging to Christian morale than simply executing him as a martyr. Erasmus's response was uncompromising, but respectful. He acknowledged Diocletian's earthly authority while making clear that his ultimate allegiance belonged to Jesus Christ and that no earthly power could force him to betray his Lord and Savior. This response, delivered with calm dignity despite his precarious situation, reportedly impressed even some members of Diocletian's court with its courage and consistency. When persuasion failed, Diocletian ordered the first round of tortures designed to break Erasmus's will without killing him immediately. The bishop was subjected to severe beatings with rods and whips, each blow intended to demonstrate the foolishness of his resistance. Contemporary accounts describe Erasmus enduring these torments while continuously praying aloud, his voice never wavering despite the obvious agony he was experiencing. The most dramatic torture involved immersion in boiling oil, a form of punishment that typically resulted in immediate death from shock and burns. Soldiers heated a large cauldron of oil to a temperature that would normally prove instantly fatal, then forced Erasmus into the scalding liquid. What happened next became one of the most celebrated miracle stories in early Christian literature. Erasmus not only survived the ordeal, but emerged from the oil apparently unharmed, his skin showing no signs of burns or damage. This miraculous survival had an electrifying effect on everyone who witnessed it. Many of the Roman soldiers and court officials were visibly shaken, some whispering that Erasmus must indeed be protected by a powerful deity. Several contemporary accounts mention immediate conversions among the spectators, including some members of Diocletian's own household who secretly began to consider the truth of Christian claims about divine protection for the faithful. The miraculous survival of the boiling oil ordeal created a serious problem for Roman authorities. Rather than breaking Erasmus's spirit or discrediting him before potential Christian followers, the failed execution had enhanced his reputation and created dangerous questions about the power of the Christian God. Diocletian, unwilling to release such a prominent Christian leader but uncertain how to proceed, ordered Erasmus confined in the most secure prison available while imperial advisors debated his fate. The prison where Erasmus was held was a formidable structure designed to contain the empire's most dangerous criminals and political prisoners. Built of massive stone blocks with iron-reinforced doors and windows, it was considered absolutely escape-proof. The bishop was placed in the deepest, most isolated cell, chained hand and foot, and guarded around the clock by soldiers who had been warned of his supposed magical powers and ability to influence others. Despite these precautions, Bishop Erasmus managed to escape in circumstances that contemporary Christian writers described as nothing short of miraculous. According to their accounts, Erasmus spent his time in prison in constant prayer and fasting, preparing himself spiritually for whatever trials lay ahead. On the night of his escape, his cell was allegedly filled with divine light. His chains fell away without human intervention, and the locked doors opened of their own accord. The discovery of Erasmus's empty cell the next morning sent shockwaves through the Roman administration. A thorough investigation failed to explain how such a heavily guarded prisoner could simply vanish without trace. The guards swore they had heard no sounds during the night and insisted that the cell had been properly secured. This inexplicable escape became the subject of rumors and speculation throughout the region, further enhancing Erasmus's reputation among both Christians and pagans. Rather than fleeing to safety, Erasmus made the extraordinary decision to remain in the area and continue his Christian ministry. This choice demonstrated either remarkable courage or what his enemies considered dangerous fanaticism. Operating now as a fugitive with a substantial price on his head, he moved constantly from place to place, conducting secret Christian services, baptizing new converts, and providing spiritual guidance to increasingly persecuted communities. The most dramatic incident during this period of underground ministry involved the reported resurrection of a young man who had died in the town of Gaeta, not far from Formiae. According to Christian sources, Erasmus was secretly brought to the family's home, where the young man's body lay prepared for burial. After hours of prayer, the bishop reportedly called upon Christ's power to restore life, and the young man awakened, completely healthy and bearing testimony to his experience of divine intervention. News of this alleged resurrection spread like wildfire throughout the region, creating massive interest in Erasmus's teachings and drawing hundreds of people seeking to hear the bishop who could apparently raise the dead. The crowds that gathered wherever he preached became so large that maintaining secrecy became virtually impossible, despite the obvious danger to both Erasmus and his followers. The impact of these events on local Roman officials was profound and troubling. They found themselves dealing not just with a fugitive Christian bishop, but with a folk hero whose reported miracles were inspiring mass conversions and threatening the stability of traditional Roman religion throughout their jurisdiction. Reports to higher authorities emphasized the urgent need to recapture Erasmus before his influence spread even further. The challenge facing Roman authorities was complicated by the apparent divine protection that seemed to surround Erasmus. Previous attempts to execute him had failed spectacularly, and his escape from their most secure prison suggested that conventional methods might be inadequate. Some officials began to wonder privately whether they were fighting not just against a man, but against supernatural forces that might prove impossible to overcome through normal means. Emperor Maximian, ruling the western portion of the Roman Empire as Diocletian's co-emperor, had earned a reputation for exceptional cruelty that surpassed even the brutal standards of his era. When reports reached him of Bishop Erasmus's continued defiance, miraculous escapes, and growing influence among the population, Maximian saw both a personal challenge to his authority and an opportunity to demonstrate the futility of Christian resistance through unprecedented brutality. Unlike Diocletian, who had initially approached the Christian problem with some degree of political calculation and reluctance, Maximian viewed the persecution as an opportunity to indulge his sadistic tendencies while serving imperial policy. His previous actions against Christians had established him as the more ruthless of the two emperors, and he was determined that the case of Erasmus would serve as a definitive demonstration of what happened to those who defied Roman authority. Maximian's agents finally succeeded in recapturing Erasmus through betrayal. A Christian who had been tortured beyond endurance revealed the bishop's location in exchange for mercy for his family. The arrest was carried out with overwhelming force to prevent any possibility of escape, and Erasmus found himself once again in Roman custody, this time facing an emperor with no interest in negotiation or mercy. The emperor's first innovation was the construction of a specially designed torture device that would come to be known as the barrel of nails. This diabolical contraption consisted of a large wooden barrel, its interior surface completely lined with iron spikes and sharp nails of varying lengths. The victim would be sealed inside this horrific chamber, and then the barrel would be rolled down a steep hillside, ensuring that every rotation would drive the spikes deeper into the victim's flesh. Contemporary accounts describe the construction of this device with horrifying precision. Skilled craftsmen were commissioned to create a barrel that would maximize suffering while avoiding immediate death. The nails were positioned and sized to inflict maximum pain without striking vital organs too quickly. The barrel's construction became a public spectacle in itself, with crowds gathering to witness the preparation of what was intended to be Erasmus's final torment. On the appointed day, Bishop Erasmus was brought before a massive crowd that had assembled to witness what Maximian promised would be the definitive refutation of Christian claims about divine protection. The emperor delivered a speech emphasizing that no god could save Erasmus from the fate that awaited him, and that his death would prove the superiority of Roman power over Christian superstition. Erasmus was stripped, forced into the barrel of nails, and the lid was sealed shut. The barrel was then positioned at the top of a rocky hillside and, at Maximian's signal, pushed over the edge. What followed was a terrifying spectacle as the barrel tumbled down the slope, each impact driving the nails deeper into the bishop's flesh, while the crowd listened to his screams of agony echoing from within the deadly chamber. When the barrel finally came to rest at the bottom of the hill, Roman soldiers approached, expecting to find a mutilated corpse. Instead, they discovered Bishop Erasmus still alive, bloodied but conscious, his wounds apparently far less severe than the torture device should have inflicted. Once again, what was intended as a definitive execution had become another demonstration of what Christians interpreted as divine intervention on behalf of their persecuted bishop. The crowd's reaction to this second miraculous survival was even more dramatic than their response to the boiling oil incident. Many fell to their knees, some proclaiming their conversion to Christianity on the spot, while others fled in terror from what they could only interpret as supernatural intervention. Even some of Maximian's own soldiers were visibly shaken by what they had witnessed, their faith in Roman power and traditional religion severely undermined by these inexplicable events. By 303 AD, the repeated survival of Bishop Erasmus had become a source of profound embarrassment and growing concern for Roman authorities throughout the empire. News of his miraculous escapes from torture and execution had spread far beyond the borders of Italy, inspiring Christian communities across the Mediterranean world and raising dangerous questions about the effectiveness of Roman power against those protected by the Christian God. Emperor Maximian, his reputation for ruthless efficiency, now tarnished by his failure to execute a single Christian bishop, became obsessed with finding a method of execution that would prove definitively fatal while serving as the ultimate deterrent to other Christian leaders. He consulted with torture specialists, military engineers, and even pagan priests, seeking divine guidance on how to overcome what appeared to be supernatural protection. The solution they devised was both ingeniously cruel and psychologically calculated to maximize terror among potential Christian converts. Rather than attempting another spectacular public torture that might result in miraculous survival, they would opt for a slower, more methodical approach that would make divine intervention impossible to claim and demonstrate the absolute futility of faith in the face of systematic Roman brutality. The windlass, a mechanical device typically used for lifting heavy objects or tightening ropes, would be modified for the specific purpose of extracting Bishop Erasmus's intestines from his living body. This method had the advantage of being controllable, allowing the executioners to prolong the process for maximum suffering while ensuring that death would eventually be inevitable regardless of any claimed divine intervention. The execution was scheduled for a major public holiday when the largest possible crowd could be assembled to witness the spectacle. Roman authorities understood that the psychological impact of Erasmus's death would be as important as the physical reality. They needed not just to kill him, but to do so in a way that would break the spirit of Christian resistance throughout their jurisdiction. On the appointed day, a vast crowd gathered in the main square of the provincial capital. The audience included Roman officials, military commanders, local dignitaries, curious pagans, and a substantial number of Christians who had come despite the obvious danger to witness their bishop's final hours. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation and dread, as everyone understood they were about to witness something unprecedented in its calculated cruelty. Bishop Erasmus was brought forward, his hands bound but his bearing still dignified despite months of imprisonment and torture. Contemporary accounts describe him as gaunt from deprivation, but spiritually radiant, his eyes filled with the peace that had sustained him through years of persecution. As he surveyed the crowd, witnesses reported that he smiled and began to pray aloud for their salvation. The windlass apparatus had been positioned prominently in the center of the square, its mechanical components gleaming in the sunlight like some diabolic altar. Roman executioners, selected for their experience and lack of squeamishness, made final preparations while explaining to the crowd exactly what was about to occur, ensuring that everyone understood the methodical nature of the torture that would follow. Erasmus was forced to lie on a specially constructed table, his arms and legs securely fastened to prevent any movement that might interfere with the execution process. The executioners then made a careful incision in his abdomen, exposing his internal organs while ensuring that no immediately vital structures were damaged. The initial cutting drew gasps and cries from the watching crowd, but the bishop himself continued praying audibly, his voice steady despite the obvious agony he was experiencing. The moment that defined Saint Erasmus's place in Christian history began when the Roman executioners carefully extracted a section of his intestines and attached them to the windlass mechanism. The device had been positioned so that the entire crowd could witness every rotation of the handle and observe the slow, methodical extraction of the bishop's internal organs from his living body. This calculated theatricality was designed to maximize the psychological impact on Christian observers. As the windlass began to turn, drawing out the bishop's intestines like thread from a spool, witnesses reported that Erasmus continued to pray aloud, his voice remaining remarkably steady despite the unimaginable agony he was experiencing. His prayers were not pleas for mercy or rescue, but expressions of forgiveness for his executioners and gratitude for being deemed worthy to suffer for Christ's sake. The execution proceeded with horrifying deliberation. Each turn of the windlass drew out more of the bishop's internal organs, while Roman officials ensured that he remained conscious and aware throughout the ordeal. Medical knowledge of the era allowed executioners to understand which organs could be removed without causing immediate death, prolonging the victim's suffering for what contemporary accounts suggest was several hours. Perhaps most remarkable was the effect of Erasmus's behavior on the watching crowd. Rather than the display of divine abandonment that Roman authorities had hoped to demonstrate, the bishop's courage and continued faith in the face of ultimate torture created a profound impression on many observers. Some contemporary sources report that even hardened Roman soldiers were moved to tears by the dignity with which he faced his torment. As his strength finally began to fail, Bishop Erasmus was reported to have delivered a final sermon to the crowd, his weakening voice nevertheless carrying clearly across the square. He spoke of the temporary nature of physical suffering compared to eternal spiritual rewards, forgave his executioners, and urged any Christians present to remain faithful regardless of the persecution they might face. His final words were reportedly a prayer of thanksgiving for the privilege of martyrdom. The death of Bishop Erasmus marked the end of one of the most prolonged and dramatic martyrdoms in early Christian history. But it also marked the beginning of his transformation from persecuted bishop to revered saint. Rather than breaking Christian resistance as Roman authorities had hoped, his martyrdom inspired believers throughout the empire and created a powerful symbol of faith, triumphant over earthly power. News of the execution spread rapidly throughout Christian communities across the Mediterranean world. The story of Erasmus's 7-year exile, miraculous survivals, and final courageous death became a source of inspiration and strength for believers facing their own persecution. Churches were eventually dedicated to his memory, and his feast day became an important celebration in the Christian calendar. The psychological impact on Roman authorities was profound and unexpected. Rather than demonstrating the futility of Christian resistance, Erasmus's martyrdom had revealed the limitations of imperial power when confronted with absolute spiritual conviction. The emperor's inability to break one man's faith, despite the most extreme measures available, raised troubling questions about the ultimate effectiveness of persecution as a policy. Within a decade of Erasmus's death, the Great Persecution had largely collapsed, undermined by its own brutality and the stubborn resistance it had provoked, rather than eliminated. Emperor Constantine's conversion to Christianity and the Edict of Milan in 313 AD officially ended the persecution, creating an empire where those who had suffered like Erasmus would be honored as heroes rather than hunted as criminals. The transformation of Bishop Erasmus from martyred victim to revered saint began almost immediately after his death in 303 AD. Early Christian communities, despite the ongoing persecution, began collecting and preserving accounts of his life, sufferings, and martyrdom. These stories, initially transmitted orally among believers who had witnessed his ministry or heard first-hand accounts from those who had, gradually became part of the written tradition of Christian hagiography. Within the 1st century after his martyrdom, Bishop Erasmus had become Saint Erasmus, with churches throughout Italy and beyond claiming connections to his ministry or possessing relics associated with his life and death. The city of Formiae, where he had served as bishop, became a major pilgrimage destination, with the faithful traveling from across the empire to pray at the site of his ministry and martyrdom. The iconography associated with Saint Erasmus developed directly from the circumstances of his death. Medieval and Renaissance artists consistently depicted him with the windlass that had been used in his execution, often showing the mechanical device with his intestines wound around it like rope. This graphic imagery, while disturbing to modern sensibilities, served as a powerful reminder to believers of the ultimate price that early Christians had paid for their faith. The devotional tradition surrounding Saint Erasmus grew particularly strong among sailors and those whose livelihoods depended on the sea. This connection arose from his association with Formiae, a coastal city, and perhaps from the symbolic resemblance between ship's rigging and the windlass of his martyrdom. Sailors facing the dangers of ancient Mediterranean navigation found inspiration in a saint who had endured the ultimate physical trial while maintaining his faith and dignity. Medical professionals and those suffering from abdominal ailments also claimed Saint Erasmus as their patron, drawing obvious connections between his martyrdom and their own concerns with internal medicine and digestive disorders. Medieval hospitals and medical schools often placed themselves under his protection, seeing in his endurance of physical suffering a model for both healing and patient care. The theological significance of Saint Erasmus's martyrdom extended far beyond devotional practices or professional patronages. Early church fathers cited his example when developing doctrines about the nature of martyrdom, the relationship between physical suffering and spiritual victory, and the power of faith to transcend earthly circumstances. His story became a cornerstone in Christian arguments about the superiority of spiritual over temporal authority. During the medieval period, when Europe was predominantly Christian, the story of Saint Erasmus took on additional layers of meaning related to resistance against tyrannical authority. Medieval chroniclers and theologians drew parallels between Roman persecution and various contemporary struggles between church and state, using Erasmus's example to justify ecclesiastical resistance to secular power when matters of faith were at stake. The Renaissance period saw renewed artistic interest in Saint Erasmus's story, with painters and sculptors creating increasingly sophisticated depictions of his martyrdom. These works, commissioned by wealthy patrons and displayed in prominent churches, served both aesthetic and educational purposes, bringing the saint's story to largely illiterate populations through visual narrative and emotional impact. The Protestant Reformation created interesting complications for the veneration of Saint Erasmus, as reformers questioned the entire tradition of saint veneration while acknowledging the historical reality and inspirational value of early Christian martyrdom. Protestant churches generally abandoned formal veneration of Saint Erasmus while continuing to honor his memory as an example of faithful witness under persecution. Modern historical scholarship has approached Saint Erasmus with the same critical methodology applied to other figures from late antiquity, attempting to separate historical fact from later legendary accretions. While some details of his story clearly reflect the devotional imagination of later centuries, the core historical reality of a Christian bishop named Erasmus, who was martyred during the Great Persecution, appears well established in contemporary sources. The continuing relevance of Saint Erasmus's story in the contemporary world relates not just to religious persecution, which unfortunately continues in many parts of the globe, but to broader questions about the relationship between conviction and compromise, the price of principled resistance, and the ultimate meaning of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. His example speaks to anyone who faces the choice between maintaining their deepest beliefs and accepting the easier path of accommodation with hostile authority. The story of Saint Erasmus, the bishop whose intestines were slowly extracted from his living body on a Roman windlass, represents more than just another account of early Christian persecution. It embodies the fundamental tension between temporal power and eternal conviction that has shaped human history for 2 millennia. In examining his life, exile, ministry, and horrific death, we encounter questions that remain as relevant today as they were in the year 303 AD. The psychological dimensions of Erasmus's martyrdom reveal the complex relationship between physical suffering and spiritual transcendence that lies at the heart of Christian theology. His ability to maintain not only his faith, but his dignity and compassion throughout months of torture challenges modern assumptions about the limits of human endurance and the sources of ultimate meaning in human existence. The political implications of his story extend far beyond religious history into the broader realm of resistance movements and the dynamics of authoritarian control. The Roman Empire's systematic persecution of Christians represented one of history's most comprehensive attempts to eliminate a belief system through state terror. Yet it ultimately failed because it could not address the fundamental human need for transcendent meaning and community. The transformation of Bishop Erasmus from victim to saint illustrates the power of narrative to shape collective memory and inspire future generations. His story became a template for understanding how individual sacrifice can serve larger communal purposes, providing a model that has influenced countless subsequent movements for social and political change. The artistic and cultural legacy of Saint Erasmus demonstrates how stories of ultimate sacrifice can inspire creative expression across centuries and cultures. From medieval illuminated manuscripts to Renaissance paintings to modern literature, his martyrdom has provided artists with a powerful symbol of the human capacity for heroism in the face of impossible odds. The medical and scientific interest in his story reflects our continuing fascination with the limits of human physical endurance and the relationship between mind and body in extreme circumstances. Modern research into pain management, psychological resilience, and the placebo effect often refers back to historical accounts of individuals who, like Erasmus, seem to transcend normal physical limitations through mental or spiritual means. The theological significance of his martyrdom continues to influence Christian thought about the nature of suffering, the meaning of sacrifice, and the relationship between earthly and eternal values. His example remains central to discussions about religious freedom, the appropriate response to persecution, and the ultimate priorities that should guide human decision-making. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Saint Erasmus reminds us that individual choices made in moments of extreme crisis can have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate circumstances. His decision to return from exile, knowing it meant certain death, influenced the course of Christian history and provided inspiration for countless individuals facing their own moments of moral testing. The historical distance between our modern world and the Roman Empire of 303 AD can make the story of Saint Erasmus seem remote and irrelevant to contemporary concerns. Yet the fundamental human experiences he embodied, faith under pressure, courage in the face of terror, and the willingness to die for one's deepest convictions, remain as powerful and challenging today as they were 17 centuries ago. In our current era, when religious persecution continues in many parts of the world, and when individuals still face life or death choices based on their beliefs and convictions, the example of Saint Erasmus provides both inspiration and sobering reflection on the true cost of integrity. His story reminds us that freedom of conscience has always been purchased with blood, and that the comfortable religious liberty enjoyed in much of the modern world rests on the sacrifices of individuals like the Bishop of Formiae, who chose death over compromise. The windlass that slowly extracted Saint Erasmus's intestines has long since crumbled to dust, and the Roman Empire that ordered his execution collapsed more than 15 centuries ago. Yet the memory of his courage, the inspiration of his example, and the questions raised by his martyrdom continue to challenge and inspire new generations of believers and seekers alike. In the end, perhaps that is the true measure of a life lived with ultimate purpose, not the length of years, but the enduring impact of choices made when everything meaningful hung in the balance.